The Ancient City. A study on the religion, laws, and institutions of Greece and Rome.
Numa Denis Fustel De Coulanges.
Book 2nd, The Family. Chapter 8, Authority in the Family. First. The principle and nature of the paternal power among the ancients.
The family did not receive its laws from the city. If the city had established private law, that law would probably have been different from what we have seen. It would have established the right of property and the right of succession on different principles, for it was not for the interest of the city that land should be inalienable and the patrimony indivisible. The law that permitted a father to sell or even to kill his son, a law that we find both in Greece and in Rome, was not established by a city. The city would rather have said to the father,
"Your wife's and your son's life does not belong to you any more than their liberty does. I will protect them, even against you. You are not the one to judge them, or to kill them. If they have committed a crime, I will be their judge."
If the city did not speak thus, it is evident that it could not. Private law existed before the city. When the city began to write its laws, it found this law already established, living, rooted in the customs, strong by universal observance. The city accepted it, because it could not do otherwise, and dared not modify it except by degrees. Ancient law was not the work of a legislator, it was, on the contrary, imposed upon the legislator. It had its birth in the family. It sprang up spontaneously from the ancient principles which gave it root. It flowed from the religious belief which was universally admitted in the primitive age of these peoples, which exercised its empire over their intelligence and their wills. A family was composed of a father, a mother, children, and slaves. This group, small as it was, required discipline. To whom, then, belonged the chief authority? To the father? No. There is in every house something that is above the father himself. It is the domestic religion, it is that God whom the Greeks called the hearth master.
Έσtia δέσποινα.
Whom the Romans called
Lar familiaris.
this divinity of the interior, or what amounts to the same thing, the belief that is in the human soul, is the least doubtful authority. This is what fixed rank in the family. The father ranks first in presence of the sacred fire. He lights it and supports it, he is its priest. In all religious acts his functions are the highest, he slays the victim, his mouth pronounces the formula of prayer which is to draw upon him and his the protection of the gods. The family and the worship are perpetuated through him, he represents, himself alone, the whole series of ancestors, and from him are to proceed the entire series of descendants. Upon him rests the domestic worship, he can almost say, like the Hindu,
I am the God.
when death shall come, he will be a divine being whom his descendants will invoke. This religion did not place woman in so high a rank. The wife takes part in the religious acts, indeed, but she is not the mistress of the hearth. She does not derive her religion from her birth. She was initiated into it at her marriage. She has learned from her husband the prayer that she pronounces. She does not represent the ancestors, since she is not descended from them. She herself will not become an ancestor, placed in the tomb, she will not receive a special worship. In death, as in life, she counts only as a part of her husband. Greek law, Roman law, and Hindu law, all derived from this old religion, agree in considering the wife as always a minor. She could never have a hearth of her own, she was never the chief of a worship. At Rome she received the title of Mater Familias, but she lost this if her husband died. Never having a sacred fire which belonged to her, she had nothing of what gave authority in the house. She never commanded, she was never even free, or mistress of herself. She was always near the hearth of another, repeating the prayer of another. For all the acts of religious life she needed a superior, and for all the acts of civil life a guardian. The laws of Manu says,
Woman, during her infancy, depends upon her father, during her youth, upon her husband, when her husband is dead, upon her sons, if she has no son, on the nearest relative of her husband, for a woman ought never to govern herself according to her own will.
The Greek laws and those of Rome are to the same effect. As a girl, she is under her father's control, if her father dies, she is governed by her brothers; married, she is under the guardianship of her husband; if the husband dies, she does not return to her own family, for she has renounced that forever by the sacred marriage. The widow remains subject to the guardianship of her husband's agnates, that is to say, of her own sons, if she has any, or, in default of sons, of the nearest kindred. So complete is her husband's authority over her, that he can, upon his death, designate a guardian for her, and even choose her a second husband. To indicate the power of the husband over the wife, the Romans had a very ancient expression, which their jurisconsults have preserved. It is the word
manus.
Hand, power.
It is not easy to discover the primitive sense of this word. The commentators make it the expression of material force, as if the wife was placed under the brutal hand of the husband. It is quite probable that this is wrong. The power of the husband over the wife results in no wise from his superior strength. It came, like all private law, from the religious belief that placed man above woman. What proves this is, that a woman who had not been married according to the sacred rites, and who, consequently, had not been associated in the worship, was not subject to the marital power. It was marriage which created this subordination, and at the same time the dignity of the wife. So true is it that the right of the strongest did not constitute the family. Let us pass to the infant. Here nature speaks for itself, loud enough. It demands that the infant shall have a protector, a guide, a master. This religion is in accord with nature. It says that the father shall be the chief of the worship, and that the son shall merely aid him in his sacred functions. But nature requires this subordination only during a certain number of years, religion requires more. Nature brings the son to his majority, religion does not grant it to him. According to ancient principles, the sacred fire is indivisible, and the same is true of property. The brothers do not separate at the death of their father, for a still stronger reason they could not separate from him during his life. In the rigor of primitive law, the sons remained attached to the father's hearth, and, consequently, subject to his authority. While he lived they were minors. We may suppose that this rule lasted only so long as the old domestic religion remained in full vigor. This unlimited subjection of the son to the father disappeared at an early day at Athens. It subsisted longer at Sparta, where a patrimony was always indivisible. At Rome the old rule was scrupulously observed: a son could never establish a separate hearth during his father's life; married even, and the father of children, he was still under parental authority. Besides, it was the same with the paternal as with the marital authority. Its principle and condition were the domestic worship. A son born of concubinage was not placed under the authority of the father. Between his father and himself there existed no community of religion. There was nothing, therefore, that conferred authority upon the one and commanded obedience of the other. Paternity, of itself, gave the father no rights. Thanks to the domestic religion, the family was a small organized body, a little society, which had its chief and its government. Nothing in modern society can give us an idea of this paternal authority. In primitive antiquity the father is not alone the strong man, the protector who has power to command obedience; he is the priest, he is heir to the hearth, the continuator of the ancestors, the parent stock of the descendants, the depositary of the mysterious rites of the worship, and of the sacred formulas of prayer. The whole religion resides in him. The very name by which he is called, pater, contains in itself some curious information. The word is the same in Greek, in Latin, and in Sanskrit, from which we may conclude that this word dates from a time when the Hellenes, the Italians, and the Hindus still lived together in Central Asia. What was its signification, and what idea did it then present to the minds of men? We can discover this, for the word has preserved its primary signification in the formulas of religious language and in those of judicial language. When the ancients, invoking Jupiter, called him
Pater hominum deorumque,
they did not intend to say that Jupiter was the father of gods and men, for they never considered him as such. They believed, on the contrary, that the human race existed before him. The same title of pater was given to Neptune, to Apollo, to Bacchus, to Vulcan, and to Pluto. These, assuredly, men never considered as their fathers, so, too, the title of Mater was applied to Minerva, Diana, and Vesta, who were reputed three virgin goddesses. In judicial language, moreover, the title of Pater, or Pater Familias, might be given to a man who had no children, who was not married, and who was not even of age to contract marriage. The idea of paternity, therefore, was not attached to this word. The Old Language had another word which properly designated the father, and which, as ancient as Pater, likewise found in the language of the Greeks, of the Romans, and of the Hindus. Genitor.
Geneter.
Genitor.
The word pater had another sense. In religious language they applied it to the gods, in legal language to every man who had a worship and a domain. The poets show us that they applied it to every one whom they wished to honor. The slave and the client applied it to their master. It was synonymous with the words
Rex.
Anax. Basileus.
It contained in itself not the idea of paternity, but that of power, authority, majestic dignity. That such a word should have been applied to the father of a family until it became his most common appellation, is assuredly a very significant fact, and one whose importance will appear to all who wish to understand ancient institutions. The history of this word suffices to give us an idea of the power which the father exercised for a long time in the family, and of the sentiment of veneration which was due him as a pontiff and a sovereign.
Second. Enumeration of the rights that composed paternal power.
Greek and Roman laws recognized in the father this unlimited power with which religion had at first clothed him. The numerous and diverse rights which these laws conferred upon him may be divided into three classes, according as we consider the father of a family as a religious chief, as the master of the property, or as a judge. 1. The father is the supreme chief of the domestic religion. He regulates all the ceremonies of the worship, as he understands them, or, rather, as he has seen his father perform them. No one contests his sacerdotal supremacy. The city itself and its pontiffs can change nothing in his worship. As priest of the hearth he recognizes no superior. As religious chief, he is responsible for the perpetuity of the worship, and, consequently, for that of the family. Whatever affects this perpetuity, which is his first care and his first duty, depends upon him alone. From this flows a whole series of rights. The right to recognize the child at its birth, or to reject it. This right is attributed to the father by the Greek laws, as well as by those of Rome. Barbarous as this is, it is not contrary to the principles on which the family is founded. Even uncontested filiation is not sufficient to admit one into the sacred circle of the family. The consent of its chief, and an initiation into its worship, are necessary. So long as the child is not associated in the domestic religion, he is nothing to the father. The right to repudiate the wife, either in case of sterility, because the family must not become extinct, or in case of adultery, because the family and the descendants ought to be free from all debasement. The right to give his daughter in marriage, that is to say, to cede to another the power which he has over her. The right of marrying his son. The marriage of the son concerns the perpetuity of the family. The right to emancipate, that is to say, to exclude a son from the family and the worship. The right to adopt, that is to say, to introduce a stranger to the domestic hearth. The right, at his death, of naming a guardian for his wife and children. It is necessary to remark that all these rights belong to the father alone, to the exclusion of all the other members of the family. The wife had not the right of divorce, at least in primitive times. Even when a widow, she could neither emancipate nor adopt. She was never the guardian even of her own children. In case of divorce, the children remained with the father, even the daughters. Her children were never in her power. Her consent was not asked for the marriage of her own daughter. 2. We have seen above that property was not understood, originally, as an individual right, but as a family right. The fortune, as Plato says, formally, and as all the ancient legislators say, implicitly, belongs to the ancestors and the descendants. This property, by its very nature, could not be divided. There could be in each family but one proprietor, which was the family itself, and only one to enjoy the use of property, the father. This principle explains several peculiarities of ancient law. The property not being capable of division, and resting entirely on the head of the father, neither wife nor children had the least part in it. The dotal system, and even the community of goods, were then unknown. The dowry of the wife belonged, without reserve, to the husband, who exercised over her dowry not only the rights of an administrator, but of an owner. Whatever the wife might have acquired during her marriage fell into the hands of her husband. She did not even recover her dower on becoming a widow. The son was in the same condition as the wife, he owned nothing. No donation made by him was valid, since he had nothing of his own. He could acquire nothing, the fruits of his labor, the profits of his trade, were his father's. If a will was made in his favor by a stranger, his father, not himself, received the legacy. This explains the provision of the Roman law which forbade all contracts of sale between father and son. If the father sold to the son, he sold to himself, as the son acquired only for the father. We see in the Roman laws, and we find also in the laws of Athens, that a father could sell his son. This was because the father might dispose of all the property of the family, and the son might be looked upon as property, since his labor was a source of income. The father might, therefore, according to choice, keep this instrument of labor, or resign it to another. To resign it was called selling the son. The texts of the Roman law that we have do not inform us clearly as to the nature of this contract of sale, nor on the reservations that might have been contained in it. It appears certain that the son thus sold did not become the slave of the purchaser. His liberty was not sold, only his labor. Even in this state the son remained subject to the paternal authority, which proves that he was not considered to have left the family. We may suppose that this sale had no other effect than to cede the possession of the son for a time by a sort of contract to hire. Later it was employed only as an indirect means of emancipating the son. 3. Plutarch informs us that at Rome women could not appear in court even as witnesses. We read in the Jurisconsult Gaius.
It should be known that nothing can be granted in the way of justice to persons under power, that is to say, to wives, sons, and slaves. For it is reasonably concluded that, since these persons can own no property, neither can they reclaim anything in point of justice. If a son, subject to his father's will, has committed a crime, the action lies against the father, nor has the father himself any action against his son.
From all this it is clear that the wife and the son could not be plaintiffs or defendants, or accusers, or accused, or witnesses. Of all the family the father alone could appear before the tribunal of the city, public justice existed only for him, and he alone was responsible for the crimes committed by his family. Justice for wife and son was not in the city, because it was in the house. The chief of the family was their judge, placed upon a judgment seat in virtue of his marital and parental authority, in the name of the family and under the eyes of the domestic divinities. Livy relates that the Senate, wishing to extirpate the worship of Bacchus from Rome, decreed the punishment of death against all who had taken part in it. The decree was easily executed upon the citizens, but when it came to the women, who were not the least guilty, a grave difficulty presented itself. The women were not answerable to the state, the family alone had the right to judge them. The Senate respected this old principle, and left to the fathers and husbands the duty of pronouncing the sentence of death against the women. This judicial authority, which the chief of the family exercised in his house, was complete and without appeal. He could condemn to death like the magistrate in the city, and no authority could modify his sentence.
The husband,
says Cato the Elder,
is the judge of his wife, his power has no limit, he can do what he wishes. If she has committed a fault, he punishes her, if she has drank wine, he condemns her, if she has been guilty of adultery, he kills her.
The right was the same in regard to children. Valerius Maximus cites a certain Attilius who killed his daughter as guilty of unchastity, and everybody will recall the father who put his son, an accomplice of Catiline, to death. Facts of this nature are numerous in Roman history. It would be a false idea to suppose that the father had an absolute right to kill his wife and children. He was their judge. If he put them to death, it was only by virtue of his right as judge. As the father of the family was alone subject to the judgment of the city, the wife and the son could have no other judge than him. Within his family he was the only magistrate. We must also remark that the paternal authority was not an arbitrary power, like that which would be derived from the right of the strongest. It had its foundation in a belief which all shared alike, and it found its limits in this same belief. For example, the father had the right to exclude his son from the family, but he well knew that if he did this the family ran a risk of becoming extinct, and the manes of his ancestors of falling into eternal oblivion. He had the right to adopt a stranger, but religion forbade him to do this if he had a son. He was sole proprietor of the goods, but he had not, at least originally, a right to alienate them. He could repudiate his wife, but to do this he had to break the religious bond which marriage had established. Thus religion imposed upon the father as many obligations as it conferred rights. Such for a long time was the ancient family. The spiritual belief was sufficient without the need of the law of force, or of the authority of a social power to constitute it regularly, to give it a discipline, a government and justice, and to establish private law in all its details.